I think what I so anyway, this is a review of Hamlet Poem Unlimited by Harold Bloom, and I think my main problem with it is it doesn't provide any actual insight into the play, and actually in a lot of ways misleads. If you read this, and this is like kind of the only piece that you read about Hamlet, you would be more confused at the end of reading it than enlightened. I mean, you don't get anything out of it. And that I can't explain why it's so bad. It's sort of a mystery. I think some of it's because Harold Bloom's, famous professor, or was a famous professor at Yale, that he gets away with making comments that make almost no sense, whatsoever. But, there's a good example of that.
Well, what's his central thesis?
He doesn't have a central thesis. I mean, the thing is, he doesn't have a central thesis. He pretends to have a central thesis in his other book, his other kind of big book on Shakespeare, where he goes through all the plays, Invention of the Human, where he claims that, if you read Shakespeare invented the human, and that Shakespeare created the modern sense of humanity, which is a humanity that listens to itself, that's introspective, listens to itself, develops because you overhear yourself. And if there's ever an example that would exist, that is a plausible thesis, you would find it in Hamlet. But he doesn't even bother trying to use the play to like prove his thesis. He just sort of says it. And this book doesn't have a thesis at all. It's kind of like he wrote a long chapter in Shakespeare, Invention of the Human, then he's like, well, I have some miscellaneous thoughts that I kind of want to get out there, and that's what this is. It's a collection of his miscellaneous, doesn't matter, it's a collection of his miscellaneous thoughts on Shakespeare, but it's kind of like if Shakespeare, Invention of the Human is bad, this is worse. And because it doesn't even try to have a thesis, just kind of goes through the play and just randomly takes things like a character like Fortinbras, for example, and sort of just kind of riffs on it. And so it's truly pretty bad. No, it is. And, I mean, some of like the worst things in it are this. He sort of says things like, "If you think your way through to the truth, then you must die of it. That Nietzschean interpretation of Hamlet, which once pleased me, now seems subtly wrong. It is dangerous to affirm that Hamlet himself is the truth. Christian believers would regard that as blasphemy, yet I do not know what else to call Hamlet. There is a God within him, and he speaks. And yet, to me, what is this quintessence of dust? Hamlet is the most refined of all Adamic dusts, but remains the old Adam and not the new, essentially dust." If you can make sense of that, if that makes any sense, then you're better than me. I don't understand what that sentence means. He contradicts himself twice within that one paragraph. He says that Hamlet is truth himself, and then he says, that's wrong, and then he goes, but I don't know what else to say. Okay, well then if you don't know what else to say, then why are you talking? It's just silly. Because he's a professor, and you can get away with this kind of thing, and people, unfortunately, I don't think most critics or most professional scholars, are fooled by this, but I think the general public is. And so almost all of his insight is kind of lost. If he has any insight, it's lost with kind of this just sort of like kind of gushing and sort of wild speculation about how great Shakespeare is and how great Hamlet is, and how Hamlet is the real writer of Hamlet. Shakespeare didn't write Hamlet. Hamlet wrote Hamlet. Hamlet is a co-author of the play. Like, that doesn't make any sense, and it's not particularly, it sounds profound, right? It sounds like, whoa, okay, Hamlet wrote Hamlet. Hamlet's a co-writer. It sounds profound, like if you're an impressionable undergrad, but if you're looking at this with a mature eye, like, I don't see how this could be satisfying in any possible way. And so he winds up missing things. So he winds up like alluding to things, and then misses them. So he doesn't follow through with the point. So, for example, in his chapter on inferring Hamlet, he talks about how he, instead of going off on the revenge, sort of like doing the revenge, he comes up with a play. The character Hamlet has a play within the play. We know that, right? It's the mousetrap. It's the murder of Gonzago. It's famous. So we know that that's part of the play. But that's also part of the revenge, right? So it's kind of like the scene after that, the time that we see. So there's a play within the play. It's a mousetrap. The King Claudius is confronted with an image of the murder. He then goes to pray. King Claudius goes to pray and finds that he can't pray because he's being psychologically tortured. So in some way, that is a part of Hamlet's revenge. Part of Hamlet's revenge is to kind of torture King Claudius and torture his mother, and torture everyone, maybe even the audience. Like that's part of his revenge. But yet, so he kind of gets almost there. Like Harold Bloom kind of gets almost there in this book, but then that doesn't really follow through with it. I guess he's a little like Hamlet. He has a kind of interesting insight where he says that the real problem with Hamlet is not that he's weak, but that he has a strong conflux of contending forces. I mean, that's on in this edition, that's on page 98. Okay, he has these. So that's true. He has these strong conflicts of contending forces. What contending forces? So we never find out. He never says, like, okay, these are the contending forces. Now, I have a theory, right, like in my first video where I said the contending forces are materialism and idealism, right? He's an idealist. He's living in a materialist world. Those are the contending forces. That's the conflict. That's why he's so freaked out. That's why Hamlet's so freaked out by sex. That's why Hamlet's freaked out by women, because they're the generators of new life and so on. That's why he's freaked out by the earth itself, because he's this idealist in this materialist world. So that's one possibility. There are these conflicting forces. It's not that Hamlet's weak or hesitant. He's conflicted, and these are the conflicts, right? He doesn't. I don't think. I'm sure I should know. He does not mention the Freudian conflict. That's a little irresponsible in a critic. He doesn't think that the Freudian criticism makes sense. He doesn't think that Hamlet wants to kill his father and sleep with his mother. He doesn't credit that, but to not mention it at all is a little weird. But then, so he acknowledges that this is what's going on. That what's the problem is that there's a conflict between that Hamlet is conflicted and has very strong impulses, but they're contradictory. And because they're contradictory, he can't do anything, right? He gets that, but he doesn't do anything with it. I mean, other critics. So, and then I think the best way of showing how bad Harold Bloom's book is to compare it with this one, which is Shakespeare After All by Marjorie Garber, and she has a short chapter on all the plays. But her analysis is so much better, and what she says, and she echoes some other critics like Paul Cantor that I've read or watched. That really what's going on in Hamlet, the conflict that Hamlet is experiencing is that he's asked to do a pre-Christian thing in a Christian world. That there is the sense that, old Hamlet, the king, right, the king that's dead, the ghost that comes back, is saying, go get revenge. I want revenge. That's like a pagan mindset, right? That's the mindset that you have before Christianity. That's the barbarian mindset, the kind of Iliad mindset. Honor is everything. If someone's dishonored you, if they've killed one of your family, you kill one of theirs, or you kill that person. And that's kind of this heroic, epic, barbaric world that but he's not part of that world. He's a Renaissance prince. He's a Christian prince. He's a thinker. He's he's a scholar. He can't do it. And that's really what's going on. That's the conflict. At least that's another argument. That Harold Bloom just kind of just ignores that possibility. Marjorie Garber goes into it.
I was just going to say that could still fit into your thesis, right? Even that argument?
I mean, it's a little different. My thesis is a little different, but I think that is a plausible thesis. He just doesn't mention. He just says, okay, Hamlet's conflicted by these two, countervailing forces, and that's why he hesitates. Okay, but what countervailing forces? He doesn't say. But Marjorie Garber does kind of explain it in greater detail. The other thing that he alludes to is all the plays within the plays. That to some extent Hamlet is playing for us, but he's also playing for everyone else. He's playing for Horatio, right? But there's a lot more you could do with that thesis. And Marjorie Garber does go into it and explain all the different times that you're watching a play of people watching a play. So the most obvious example is the Mousetrap itself, right? In the Mousetrap, you're watching a play that Hamlet's written in part, and you're watching Hamlet. You're watching Claudius's reaction to that play. You're watching King Claudius's reaction to that play. So you're watching a play of a play. But there are many other examples, and when I first read Hamlet and watched it, I didn't realize how many there really are. I mean, in the very first scene or second scene, there's the first scene, there's a what she calls a dumb show, which is one character is kind of miming and doing something, and people are reacting to that show, and that's the appearance of the ghost. So that's the first example of a play within a play, right? And there's so many other examples because everyone is overhearing someone else. So there's always someone behind the curtain, right? And the first one is where Polonius is behind the curtain. And that's the first reaction that we see with the first interaction that we have with Hamlet and with Ophelia. And then there's a second one with where this time it's Claudius and Polonius behind the curtain, so to speak, and they're watching and listening to the second reaction between Ophelia and Hamlet. And then the third is where Hamlet is talking to his mother and Polonius is behind the curtain. So you're always sort of watching someone watching something, or you're watching someone listening to something. And then the last one, which is I think the most interesting, and that goes back to this conflict of, epic versus modern, like barbarian versus Christian, is that in the very last scene of the play, you have a fight, but it's not a real fight. It's a staging. It's there, and Marjorie Garber talks about this. She doesn't use these very words, but she does talk about the contrast between what old Hamlet was like, the old king was like, but what was he like? He went out and he killed people with like a battle axe, right? I don't know if it was a battle. I don't remember for some reason, but it's whatever weapon he had. We can imagine it's a hammer. It's like some Game of Thrones hammer, and it's a barbaric tool. He smashes the other guy and kills him, and takes all his land. But what's the weapon that they use in the very last sort of fight? The very last scene is, well, they're not really swords. They're foils. They're rapiers. They're fake swords.
Okay.
So it's a show. The whole thing is just a show. So that's the last example of you're watching a play of a play, right? In the play, what's happening is Laertes and Hamlet are fighting, but they're not really fighting. It's just a duel. It's just a game. It's not a real contest. Nothing is really at stake. It turns out that reality sets in, and one side is trying to poison the other side. But it's really this play within a play within a play, right? So Margaret Garber really explains that. Harold Bloom does not. He just sort of has these ideas that don't go anywhere, and ultimately, after reading Poem Unlimited, I don't think I understand the play, the play Hamlet, any more than what I did before. I just kind of feel unsatisfied because I think he does know his stuff. Like, he is a smart guy, but I think there's kind of arrogance in his writing that he feels like he can say things without justifying them, without pointing to the text. And that's bad. And I think that people who are coming to, criticism, if they come to this first, they're going to be pretty confused.